The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountainside as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison checked his watch. 3 hours until extraction. His team of 8 Navy SEALs had successfully completed their primary mission, eliminating a high-value target who had been coordinating attacks on coalition forces. The compound below lay silent, smoke still rising from the destroyed communications center. "Overwatch, this is Raptor 6, Morrison spoke into his radio. "Package secured, moving to extraction point Charlie in 15 minutes. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, the team's sniper, adjusted his position on the rocky outcrop 200 meters above the compound. Through his scope, he watched his teammates methodically clearing the area, collecting intelligence, and preparing for the helicopter pickup. Everything had gone according to plan. According to plan. Chen had learned to trust his instincts during his 12 years in special operations. Something felt wrong. The compound had been too lightly defended for such an important target. The guards had seemed almost surprised by the assault, as if they hadn't expected it. Most troubling of all, the target himself had been found alone in his quarters, almost as if he'd been waiting. "Raptor 6, this is Overwatch," Chen radioed down to Morrison. "I've got movement on the eastern ridge, multiple heat signatures moving in from 3 different directions." Morrison's blood ran cold. The eastern ridge was supposed to be clear. Their intelligence had confirmed no enemy presence in that sector. "How many, Overwatch?" "Counting at least 40 hostiles, maybe more. They're using the terrain well, staying in the shadows. Professional movement patterns." Chen's voice remained calm, but Morrison could hear the underlying tension. "Boss, I think we walked into a trap." The realization hit Morrison like a physical blow. The easy mission, the light resistance, the isolated target. It had all been designed to draw them in. Someone had fed them false intelligence, and now his team was caught in a kill box with nowhere to run. "All teams! Defensive positions now!" Morrison shouted over the radio. "We've got company coming from the east. Prep for extended engagement." The 8 SEALs immediately began fortifying their positions around the compound. Sergeant First Class Tony Rodriguez set up his machine gun to cover the main approach. Petty Officer Luis Vega and Petty Officer David Kim took positions in the destroyed guard towers. The rest of the team spread out to cover all possible approaches. From his elevated position, Chen could see the full scope of the trap. The enemy forces were moving with military precision, not the usual chaotic assault of insurgent fighters. These were trained soldiers, possibly foreign special forces advisors. They had night vision equipment, modern weapons, and most importantly, they knew exactly where the SEALs were positioned. "Raptor 6, we've got a problem," Chen reported. "These aren't local fighters. Movement is too coordinated, equipment too advanced. I'm seeing at least 3 separate assault teams moving to surround the compound." Morrison felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. His team was elite, but they were outnumbered 5-1 and caught in the open. The nearest friendly forces were over 50 kilometers away, and the extraction helicopter wouldn't arrive for another 3 hours, if it could even land in a hot zone. "What's our play, boss?" asked Rodriguez, his voice steady despite their desperate situation. Morrison studied the terrain through his binoculars. The compound sat in a shallow valley with steep ridges on 3 sides. The only escape route was a narrow canyon to the west, but Chen was reporting movement there, too. They were completely surrounded. "We hold position and wait for extraction," Morrison decided. "Overwatch, I need you to start thinning them out. Priority targets are anyone with heavy weapons or communications equipment." "Roger that," Chen replied, already adjusting his rifle. Through his scope, he could see an enemy soldier setting up what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The shot was over 600 meters in challenging wind conditions, but Chen had made harder shots before. The rifle's report echoed across the valley, and the enemy soldier dropped. Immediately, the other hostiles began scrambling for cover, their careful advance turning into a desperate search for protection from the unseen sniper. but Chen knew he had just announced his position to every enemy fighter in the area. Within seconds, he could hear the whistle of incoming mortar rounds. He rolled away from his position just as the first shell exploded where he had been lying. "Overwatch is taking fire," Chen reported, relocating to a new position. "They've got mortars and they're walking them up the ridge." Down in the compound, Morrison's team could hear the explosions getting closer to their sniper's position. Without Chen's overwatch, they would be completely vulnerable to the approaching assault teams. "Can you relocate?" Morrison asked. "Working on it," Chen replied, army crawling across the rocky terrain as mortar shells continued to fall around him. "But they've got my general area dialed in. Every time I take a shot, they're going to bracket me with indirect fire." The enemy assault teams were getting closer now. Morrison could see muzzle flashes in the tree line as advanced scouts began probing the compound's defenses. His men returned fire, but their ammunition was limited. They had packed light for what was supposed to be a quick in-and-out mission. "Movement on the north wall," reported Kim from his position in the guard tower. "At least 10 fighters moving fast." "I see them," Rodriguez replied, swinging his machine gun around. The steady beat of automatic weapons fire filled the air as he engaged the advancing enemy. 2 fighters went down, but the others continued forward, using the compound's outer buildings for cover. Morrison got on the radio to call for immediate extraction, but the response wasn't what he wanted to hear. "Raptor 6, this is base. Extract birds are taking heavy ground fire at alternate LZs. Enemy has anti-aircraft weapons positioned throughout the valley. Cannot approach until threat is neutralized." The lieutenant commander closed his eyes for a moment. His team was trapped, outnumbered, low on ammunition, and now had no hope of immediate extraction. The enemy had planned this perfectly. They knew the SEALs' mission, their timing, their extraction points. Someone had sold them out. "Sir, we've got company," Vega called out. Through the southern perimeter, another group of enemy soldiers was advancing. These carried heavier weapons, machine guns, grenade launchers, and what appeared to be shoulder-fired missiles. Chen, despite the continuous mortar fire raining down around him, managed to find a new firing position behind a large boulder. Through his scope, he could see enemy fighters moving through the compound's outer defenses. His teammates were fighting bravely, but they were being pressed from all sides. He lined up a shot on an enemy squad leader who was directing an assault team toward Rodriguez's position. The bullet found its mark, and the advancing fighters hesitated, confused by the sudden loss of their commander. But Chen knew it wasn't enough. For every enemy fighter he eliminated, 2 more seemed to take their place. "Boss, I count at least 60 hostiles now," Chen reported. "They're bringing up heavy weapons. Looks like they're preparing for a major assault." Morrison looked around at his men. They were all experienced warriors who had been in tough spots before, but this was different. This felt like a last stand. The compound offered some protection, but not enough to hold off a sustained assault by superior numbers. "How much ammo do we have?" Morrison asked. 200 rounds for the 240, Rodriguez replied, referring to his machine gun. "Maybe 3 magazines each for personal weapons." It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for a prolonged engagement against 60 enemy fighters. Morrison made a decision that went against every instinct he had as a team leader. He was going to have to ask one of his men to make the ultimate sacrifice. "Overwatch," Morrison called up to Chen. "I need you to keep providing cover for as long as possible. We're going to try to thin their numbers and hope extraction can get through." "Roger that, boss," Chen replied. He understood what Morrison wasn't saying. The sniper was being asked to stay exposed on the ridge, drawing enemy fire and attention, while his teammates tried to hold the compound. It was essentially a suicide mission. As if to emphasize the danger, another mortar round exploded just 20 meters from Chen's position, showering him with rock fragments. He could taste blood in his mouth and feel warm liquid running down his face. But his hands remained steady on his rifle. The enemy assault began in earnest just as the sun reached its highest point. From 3 directions simultaneously, coordinated teams of fighters advanced on the compound. Morrison's SEALs fought with everything they had, but it was clear they were being overwhelmed. "We can't hold them," Kim shouted over the gunfire. "They're inside the perimeter." Morrison could see enemy fighters moving between the buildings inside the compound. His team was about to be overrun, and there was nowhere to retreat. In a few more minutes, it would all be over. That's when Chen made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to provide long-range support, he began moving down the ridge toward the compound. If his teammates were going to die, he wasn't going to watch it happen from a distance. But as he moved through the rocky terrain, Chen noticed something that made him stop. There was another position, higher up on the ridge behind him, that offered a better angle on the entire battlefield. It would be even more exposed than where he'd been, but it would give him a clear shot at every enemy position around the compound. Without hesitating, Chen began climbing toward what would likely become his final firing position. His teammates needed every advantage they could get, and he was going to give it to them, no matter the cost. The battle for the compound was about to enter its deadliest phase, and somewhere high above the chaos, a lone sniper was preparing to make his last stand. The gunfire below had become constant now, a deadly symphony of automatic weapons, explosions, and shouted commands. From his new position 800 meters above the compound, Chen could see the full scope of the battle unfolding. His teammates were completely surrounded, fighting from room to room as enemy forces poured into the compound from all sides. Through his scope, Chen watched Rodriguez's machine gun position get overrun. The sergeant was forced to abandon his weapon and fall back to the main building with Vega and Kim. Morrison and the other SEALs were consolidating their defense in the compound's central structure, but Chen could see it was only a matter of time before they were completely overwhelmed. "Overwatch to Raptor 6, Chen radioed down. "I'm in position for long-range support. Give me targets." "Any target you can find," Morrison replied, his voice strained. "They're everywhere." Chen began working methodically through the enemy positions. His first shot eliminated a fighter who was about to throw a grenade into the building where his teammates were sheltering. His second took down an enemy sniper who had been targeting the windows. Each shot was deliberate, calculated, and deadly accurate. But for every enemy fighter Chen eliminated, the situation below continued to deteriorate. The hostile forces had brought up heavier weapons now, rocket-propelled grenades that were systematically destroying the compound's defensive positions. Chen could see his teammates being forced deeper into the building's interior. What worried him most was the ammunition situation. His teammates' weapons were falling silent for longer periods between engagements, a sure sign they were running low on rounds. Rodriguez's machine gun had gone quiet completely after he'd been forced to abandon it. Chen was facing his own supply problems. He'd started the mission with 60 rounds for his sniper rifle. After the extended engagement, he was down to fewer than 20. Every shot had to count, but there were still at least 40 enemy fighters moving around the compound. That's when he noticed something that changed his entire tactical assessment. The enemy forces weren't just trying to eliminate his team, they were trying to capture them alive. The assault teams were using non-lethal tactics wherever possible, focusing on suppression rather than killing shots. Several times, Chen had watched enemy fighters hold their fire when they could have easily eliminated one of his teammates. The realization made Chen's blood run cold. Someone wanted the SEALs taken alive, which meant interrogation, torture, and eventually public execution for propaganda purposes. His teammates would be better off dying in the compound than being captured. "Raptor 6, be advised," Chen radioed down. "Enemy forces are trying to take you alive. They're holding back from killing shots." There was a long pause before Morrison responded. "Understood, Overwatch. Continue mission." Both men knew what that meant. If capture seemed imminent, the SEALs would fight to the death rather than be taken prisoner. But that moment was approaching rapidly, as enemy forces systematically cleared each room of the main building. Chen adjusted his scope and began targeting the enemy commanders who were coordinating the assault. If he could disrupt their command structure, it might buy his teammates a few more precious minutes. His next shot dropped an officer who had been directing fighters through a handheld radio. The enemy response was immediate and overwhelming. Mortar shells began falling all around Chen's position, forcing him to relocate once again. But this time, there was nowhere to go. He was on the highest point of the ridge, with enemy spotters now focused on his location. As Chen low-crawled across the rocky ground, he could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Maybe extraction had finally arrived. But as the sound grew closer, Chen realized it wasn't the familiar beat of American helicopters. Through his scope, he could see two enemy helicopters approaching from the north. They were flying low, moving fast, and carrying what appeared to be additional assault troops. The trap was about to be reinforced with fresh fighters. "Raptor 6, we've got incoming air support for the hostiles," Chen reported. "Two helicopters probably carrying another 20 fighters." Morrison's response was grim. "Copy that, Overwatch. We're almost out of ammo down here. Maybe 5 minutes of sustained fire left." Chen made a decision that went against every tactical doctrine he'd been taught. Instead of providing cover fire for his teammates, he was going to target the helicopters. It was an almost impossible shot, moving targets at extreme range with unpredictable flight patterns. But if he could damage or destroy even one of them, it might prevent the enemy reinforcements from landing. He settled into a stable firing position and began tracking the lead helicopter through his scope. The aircraft was flying in a standard approach pattern, but the pilot was good, varying altitude and speed to make targeting difficult. Chen would have one shot, maybe two, before the helicopters spotted his muzzle flash and eliminated his position. Chen controlled his breathing, waited for the helicopter to steady for just a moment, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the aircraft's tail rotor assembly, sending metal fragments flying. The helicopter began spinning wildly, the pilot fighting to maintain control as the aircraft pitched and yawed across the sky. The second helicopter immediately broke off its approach and began searching for the sniper's position. Chen was already moving, but he knew he'd been spotted. The aircraft was heading directly toward his position, its door gunners preparing to spray the entire ridge with automatic weapons fire. That's when Chen heard something that changed everything. The distinct sound of American helicopters approaching from the south. Two Apache attack helicopters appeared over the southern ridge, their 30mm cannons already spinning up for engagement. "This is Thunder Lead to any friendly forces in the area," came a voice over Chen's radio. "We have visual on enemy aircraft and ground forces. Identify your position for danger close fire support." Chen had never been so happy to hear another human voice. "Thunder Lead. This is Overwatch. Friendly sniper on the eastern ridge, grid reference 41R PQ 12345 67890. Enemy helicopters are engaging my position. Copy that, Overwatch. Take cover and stay down." The Apache helicopters descended like avenging angels. Their first volley of missiles eliminated the damaged enemy helicopter that Chen had hit. The second aircraft tried to flee, but was caught by a burst of 30mm cannon fire that sent it spinning into the valley floor in a ball of flame. With air superiority established, the Apaches turned their attention to the ground forces surrounding the compound. Chain gun fire and Hellfire missiles began systematically eliminating enemy positions around the perimeter. The coordinated assault on Morrison's team suddenly turned into a chaotic retreat as enemy fighters tried to escape the devastating air attack. But Chen could see that some enemy forces were still inside the main building with his teammates. The Apache pilots couldn't engage those targets without risking friendly casualties. The close quarters battle was still ongoing, and his teammates were still in mortal danger. Chen repositioned himself to get a clear view into the compound. Through his scope, he could see muzzle flashes from inside the main building. His teammates were still fighting room by room against the enemy forces that had made it inside. Thunder Lead, this is Overwatch, Chen radioed to the Apache pilots. Friendlies are still engaged inside the main building. I need you to clear the perimeter so I can provide precision fire support. Roger that, Overwatch. Give us 2 minutes to clear the outside positions. Chen watched as the Apache helicopters systematically eliminated every enemy fighter in the compound's courtyard and outer buildings. But he could also see that time was running out for his teammates inside. The building had gone ominously quiet. Either the fighting was over, or his friends were conserving their last few rounds for a final stand. Raptor 6, this is Overwatch, Chen called on the radio. Air support has cleared the perimeter. What's your status? The radio crackled with static for several seconds before Morrison's voice came through, weak but determined. Overwatch, we're down to pistols and grenades. Enemy forces are 1 room away from our position. If you've got any miracles left, now would be a good time. Chen studied the building through his scope. He could see movement through the windows, enemy fighters positioning themselves for a final assault on his teammates' position. The angle was difficult, the range was extreme, and he was down to his last few rounds. But his teammates needed him now more than ever. What happened next would be talked about in special operations circles for years to come. Chen began engaging targets inside the building with precision that seemed almost supernatural. His first shot eliminated an enemy fighter who was about to throw a grenade into his teammate's room. His second took down a fighter who was preparing to breach their door with explosives. From their defensive position, Morrison and his team could hear the enemy assault suddenly falter. Fighters who had been advancing confidently toward their room were dropping without explanation. Through the gunfire and chaos, they could hear the distant crack of Chen's rifle, impossibly accurate despite the extreme range and challenging conditions. That's our angel up there, Morrison whispered to his men. Chen still watching over us. But Chen was down to his last 3 rounds, and there were still enemy fighters in the building. Every shot had to be perfect. Every target had to be the right one. Through his scope, he could see an enemy commander organizing his fighters for one final push into the room where his teammates were trapped. Chen lined up what he knew would be one of his last shots of the battle. The target was partially concealed behind a concrete pillar at extreme range, through a window, with crosswinds affecting the bullet's trajectory. It was the kind of shot that most snipers wouldn't even attempt, but Chen wasn't most snipers. He was a guardian angel watching over his brothers in arms, and he wasn't going to let them die on his watch. Chen's final shot echoed across the valley like thunder. Through his scope, he watched the enemy commander collapse, his radio skittering across the floor as chaos erupted among the remaining fighters. Without their leader's coordination, the assault on Morrison's position fell apart. Enemy fighters began retreating from the building, no longer organized or determined. Thunder Lead, this is Overwatch, Chen radioed to the Apache helicopters. Enemy forces are withdrawing from the main building. Friendlies are secure in the northeast corner room, ground floor. Copy that, Overwatch. We'll clean up the stragglers. The Apache helicopters moved in for the final phase of the engagement, their chain guns eliminating the last pockets of resistance around the compound. Within minutes, the valley fell silent except for the sound of rotor blades and the distant crackle of burning vehicles. Chen remained in his Overwatch position, scanning for any remaining threats, even though his rifle was now empty. His body ached from hours of crawling across rocky terrain, his face was caked with blood and dust, and his ears were ringing from countless explosions. But his teammates were alive, and that was all that mattered. Overwatch, this is Raptor 6. Morrison's voice came through the radio, stronger now and filled with relief. We're moving to secure the compound. What's your status? Still breathing, Chen replied. But I'm out of ammunition and about ready to fall off this mountain. Negative on that, Marine, Morrison said with a slight chuckle. We're coming to get you. Chen smiled for the first time in hours. Morrison had called him Marine instead of his usual Navy nickname. It was the ultimate sign of respect from a Navy SEAL to acknowledge Chen's Marine Corps background. In the Brotherhood of Special Operations, there was no higher compliment. 20 minutes later, Chen could hear helicopters approaching from the south. This time, the sound was unmistakably American, the heavy beat of CH-47 Chinook helicopters coming to extract the team. But Chen knew he wasn't going anywhere until he could see his teammates boarding safely. Through his scope, Chen watched as Morrison's team emerged from the main building. All 8 SEALs were alive and mobile, though several were clearly wounded. Rodriguez was limping heavily, and Kim had his left arm in a makeshift sling, but they were all walking under their own power. The extraction helicopters landed in the compound's courtyard, their crews immediately establishing a defensive perimeter while medics rushed to treat the wounded SEALs. Chen began making his way down the rocky ridge, his legs shaking from exhaustion and the accumulated stress of the longest engagement of his military career. As he reached the compound, Chen was met by Morrison and the rest of the team. Without saying a word, Rodriguez limped over and grabbed Chen in a bear hug that lifted the sniper off his feet despite his injured leg. "You magnificent bastard," Rodriguez said, his voice thick with emotion. "You just saved all our lives." "Just doing my job," Chen replied, but his own voice was unsteady. Morrison approached and extended his hand. "Staff Sergeant Chen, on behalf of the entire team, I want you to know that your actions today were nothing short of heroic. You stayed up there under fire for over 6 hours, providing overwatch for this entire operation." Chen shook his commander's hand, but looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Sir, we all did our jobs. That's what we're trained for." "No," Morrison said firmly. "What we did today was our job. What you did was something else entirely. You chose to stay exposed on that ridge, drawing enemy fire so you could protect your teammates. That's not training. That's courage." Kim spoke up from his position near the helicopter. "Chen, we counted your shots. 27 confirmed kills at ranges up to 800 meters in challenging wind conditions while taking indirect fire. The guys back home aren't going to believe this." "They don't need to know the details," Chen said quietly. "We all came home. That's what matters." But as the team prepared to board the extraction helicopter, Chen couldn't help but think about how close they had come to disaster. The mission had been compromised from the beginning, suggesting that someone with access to classified intelligence had betrayed them. The easy part of their ordeal was over. Now came the investigation into how the enemy had known their every move. As the Chinook lifted off from the compound, Chen looked down at the battlefield where he had spent the longest day of his military career. The compound was scarred by explosions and gunfire, abandoned vehicles were still burning, and the rocky ridge where he had made his stand was cratered by mortar shells. It looked like a scene from hell. But all 8 members of his team were on this helicopter, alive and heading home. In Chen's mind, that made it the most beautiful place on Earth. The flight back to base was relatively quiet. The SEALs were exhausted, many of them dozing despite the helicopter's noise and vibration. Chen stared out the window at the Afghan countryside passing below, his mind replaying the events of the day. He thought about the shots he'd made, the decisions he'd faced, and the weight of responsibility he'd felt for his teammates' lives. When they landed at the forward operating base, Chen was surprised to find a crowd waiting for them. Word had already spread about the engagement, and it seemed like half the base had turned out to welcome them back. As the team walked across the landing zone, they were greeted with cheers and applause from their fellow service members. But Chen noticed something else in the crowd. Several senior officers who weren't there to celebrate. Their expressions were serious, and Chen realized that the debriefing process was about to begin. Someone was going to have to answer some very difficult questions about how a routine mission had turned into a 6-hour battle for survival. Over the next several hours, Chen and his teammates were separated for individual debriefings. Intelligence officers wanted to know every detail about the enemy forces they had encountered, their equipment, their tactics, their apparent coordination with outside support. Military police investigators wanted to understand how the mission details had been compromised. When Chen finally emerged from his debriefing, he was mentally and physically exhausted, but Morrison was waiting for him outside the interrogation room, along with Rodriguez and the rest of the team. "How did it go?" Morrison asked. "Lot of questions about how they knew we were coming," Chen replied. "I told them what I saw: professional military equipment, coordinated tactics, advanced knowledge of our plans. This wasn't a lucky ambush by local fighters." Morrison nodded grimly. "Same questions we all got. The investigators think someone with access to our operational planning sold us out. They're going to be digging into this for months." "Any word on who?" asked Rodriguez. "Not yet, but they'll find them. Betraying a special operations team is a career-ending mistake at minimum." Chen looked around at his teammates, these men who had fought beside him, who had trusted him to watch over them from his mountain perch. The bonds forged in combat were stronger than anything else in the military world. These weren't just fellow soldiers anymore, they were brothers. "What happens now?" Chen asked. "Now we go home," Morrison said. "The brass wants us back stateside for extended debriefs and some time off. This mission is going to be classified so far above our pay grades that we'll probably never be allowed to talk about it officially." "But we'll remember," Kim said quietly. "We'll remember what happened up on that ridge." Chen nodded. He would remember too, not just the tactical details or the successful shots, but the weight of responsibility he'd felt for these men's lives. He would remember the moment when he'd decided to climb higher up the ridge, knowing it would expose him to greater danger, but give him a better angle to protect his teammates. Most of all, he would remember the trust Morrison had placed in him when he'd called for Overwatch support. In the special operations community, being designated as Overwatch meant being trusted with the lives of your entire team. It was a responsibility that some soldiers never fully understood until they found themselves in a position where their teammates' survival depended entirely on their skill and courage. As the team walked toward the base dining facility for their first hot meal in 36 hours, Chen reflected on the events of the day. The mission had been compromised, they had been outnumbered and outgunned, and they had faced almost certain death or capture. But they had survived, and more importantly, they had done so as a team. 3 weeks later, back at their home base in Virginia, Chen received a call to report to Morrison's office. When he arrived, he found his lieutenant commander sitting behind his desk with a serious expression and several official-looking documents spread out before him. "Take a seat, Chen," Morrison said. "We need to talk about what happened in Afghanistan." Chen sat down, wondering if new information had emerged about the compromised mission or if he was about to face some kind of disciplinary action for his unconventional tactics during the engagement. Morrison picked up one of the documents and read from it. "Staff Sergeant Michael Chen for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy of the United States. While serving as team sniper during a classified special operations mission, Staff Sergeant Chen voluntarily exposed himself to intense enemy fire in order to provide Overwatch protection for his teammates who were surrounded and vastly outnumbered." Chen's eyes widened as he realized what Morrison was reading. Despite continuous mortar fire and small arms fire directed at his position, Staff Sergeant Chen remained in place for over 6 hours, engaging enemy targets at extreme ranges and in challenging environmental conditions. His accurate fire eliminated 27 enemy combatants and prevented the capture or elimination of his teammates. His actions reflect the highest traditions of military service and bring great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Navy. Morrison looked up from the document. "Chen, you're being recommended for the Navy Cross. Congratulations." Chen sat in stunned silence for a moment. The Navy Cross was the second highest decoration for valor in the United States military, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat situations. "Sir, I was just doing my job," Chen said finally. "No, you weren't," Morrison replied firmly. "Your job was to provide sniper support from a safe distance. What you did was choose to put yourself in maximum danger to give your teammates the best possible protection. That's not a job, that's heroism." As Chen left Morrison's office that day, he thought about the weight of the medal he would soon wear and the responsibility it represented. But more than that, he thought about the 8 men who had come home safely from that Afghan valley and the trust they had placed in a silent marksman watching from above. The SEALs had thought the battle was over when they completed their primary mission. But sometimes the most important fights begin just when you think you're safe. And sometimes, when everything seems hopeless, salvation comes from the most unexpected places, like a lone sniper on a mountain ridge, answering the call when his brothers needed him most.